Welcome. I'm David Peterson, Professor of Renaissance History at Washington and Lee University. It's September 22nd, and I'm here in the Mason Taylor New Room with my good friend and distinguished colleague, Professor Theodore C. DeLaney, for the 8th of our conversations about Ted's remarkable life. In the course of talking about your life, we've covered a lot of ground, and we've covered many things by means of narrative, and I know that there have not always been opportunities for you to talk as fully as you might have liked to have done about some people and their influence on your life. So today I'd like to ask you to dilate a little bit more on some of the people who've had the greatest influence, the greatest impact on your life. You offered me a few suggestions. Perhaps we should start with your maternal grandmother, Margaret Jones Franklin. She seems to have had a great influence on you.
Well, she was not only my grandmother, she was my first teacher. And one of the significant things about her is that she was very, very proud of the fact that she had finished college in 1909. Mm-hmm. And the diploma hung on the dining room wall. And of course, it is fairly unusual that women were finishing college that early, but certainly significant a black woman finishing college that early. One of the things that her life and her identification, her self-identification as a college graduate may demonstrate, at least with regard to how other people in her situation probably accommodated the truth of what happened with regard to the institution that she attended. When she finished what is now Virginia State University, which is an historically black college, it was then called Virginia Normal and Industrial Institute. Prior to that, it was called Virginia Normal and Collegiate Institute. And I was very, very curious about these name changes and had to review a book for Virginia history and biography. And this book was a book written by a historian named Adam Fairclough, and the name of the book was A Class of Their Own, Black Teachers in the Segregated South. And I learned from that book that in the early 1900s, the Virginia legislature decided that blacks didn't need a collegiate education, and they tried to restructure the college after the Booker T. Washington model. And so they removed everything collegiate from the school, and it became Virginia Normal and Industrial Institute. So technically it was not a college when she was there, but that was something that she never explained to any of us. And as one of my cousins said, she probably would not be happy that I know this. But she had her own kindergarten when I was a boy, and she babysat for me, my younger brother, and my cousin while she taught kindergarten. And she used first grade books for her kindergarten, and there was no such thing as a public kindergarten then. And so when her students would go on to grade school, the principal would let them skip grade 1. And so I was always impressed by not only her dignity, but the fact that education really mattered to her, and that education was something that was displayed on the dining room wall with this beautiful diploma that hung on the wall. But she also was a woman who seemed to be in complete control of everything that needed to happen within her household, because she was canning and making jellies and preserves and those things during the summer. And in the aside from a large vegetable garden, there were strawberry patches, there were grapevines, there was a rhubarb patch, there were peach and apple trees and cherry trees and pear trees, and so she was canning and preserving all of these things. And there was also a chicken yard, because then you could have chickens in Lexington. So a small plot of land that was also productive with regard to producing food that was going to be consumed by the family. And so an outstanding woman, and it seems to me that it's important to remember ancestors like that, particularly ancestors who have a powerful influence. And
is she one of the reasons you frequented the library as a boy?
Possibly. And she certainly would have been one of the reasons that I would have been a reader as a boy, because she taught me how to read and she taught me how to write. And so my first teacher and my grandmother, and her demise is tragic. My grandfather died in 51, and she wouldn't die until 58. But 2 or 3 years after he died, she began to enter into the world of dementia, and she spent the last years of her life institutionalized for Alzheimer's. And so sort of a tragic way to leave the earth for anybody at any point in history is to lose the ability to have your cognitive functions about you.
It must have been hard for you. I'm inferring through all of this that you were very close and very warm toward her.
Yeah, she did mean a great deal to me. And unfortunately, my mother and my aunts were unable to take care of her when she had Alzheimer's, and she would wander, and that was a real problem.
Did you have to help look after her?
Well, actually not. There was one incident where I was taking her from my aunt's house to my mother's house, and she had hold of my wrist, and I was just a boy. I'm not even sure I was a teenager yet. And she led me to what is now the Nelson Street Bridge. And the Nelson Street Bridge was built right across in front of a 2-story house that's no longer there. That was the house of her parents. And then when we got there, she was totally confused. And because of the difficulty of taking care of her, the family doctor suggested that she needed to be someplace that they could take care of her. And there were no nursing homes and those kinds of options then. And there were 4 state mental hospitals, and the only one for blacks was in Petersburg, ironically, which is where she went to college. And so she spent the last 4 years of her life in Central State Mental Hospital in Petersburg, and died in 1958. So, and by that time I was in high school. But she certainly was a very, very important person with regard to the beginning of my education, and also a very, very important person with regard to somebody who really stressed the importance of dignity and the way you appear to the public and to other people. She was very, very conscious of her own image with regard to other people. And so she always is somebody who's sort of out there in the back of my mind somewhere, who is worthy of note, and certainly worthy of great note. So,
invested a lot of time in you and your siblings.
Right.
And you've mentioned several times the importance of the Catholic Church in your upbringing. Would you like to talk a little bit about Father Karl Rykowski?
Sure, and that jumps way away from coming up in the Catholic Church to being an adult man who is sort of challenged by this almost renegade priest. And I can't remember exactly the years in the 1960s that he was at St. Patrick's, but it was sort of mid-1960s. And for a short time after I left the monastery, I was not really active in the church, and I sort of became active again. And this guy gets assigned to St. Patrick's, and he's so excited about the Second Vatican Council that he's implementing changes in the liturgy before they are officially approved. Students absolutely love this guy, and the old guard in the church pretty much blamed him for the changes that they didn't like.
Guitars in the church and this
Well,
sort of thing.
but even short of guitars, you're going from the Latin Mass to English. And of course, that is a switch that jolts some people like crazy. I mean, some of our friends who are in the Episcopal Church who go to the 8 o'clock Mass, the 8 o'clock service at the Episcopal Church because they use the 1928 prayer book and find anything other than King James English appalling. It's a good analogy to the problem with switching from Latin to English. But guitars, yeah, and of course guitars predate the organ, but guitars in church, but also when the guitars were introduced to the church when he was pastor, a lot of it was contemporary music that students liked, and the students pretty much had free rein to select the music that was going to be at Mass. But he confronted me once about what I was doing for other people. And at the time, I thought I was doing service because I was a scout leader when I was in my early 20s. And I thought that was important, and I told him what I was doing, and he just repeated the question, what are you doing for other people? And I think that what he saw there is there were a lot of people in greater need than the boys that I was working with in the Scouts, and he was right. And so he was sort of pulling my strings with regard to social justice and the idea that there is a dimension of service in this world that is far more important than helping middle-class kids in a scout troop. And he became a really close personal friend, and I saw him do things that if there had been some of the old guard in the church who had witnessed these things, they would have had exactly what they needed to call the bishop and get him removed. I'll give you an example. When he was the pastor, then the pastor still lived next door to the church, in the house that's next door to the church that we call a parish house. And there would be a coffee there every Sunday morning between the 8:30 Mass and the 10:30 Mass. That was for the students, because there are a lot of Catholic college students in Lexington even then, and particularly at VMI. And one morning I was in the rectory, and he came over from the church, and cadets were practicing music, and there was a lot of conversation. Students were in the church and in the parish house, and then all of a sudden there was quiet, and I heard him say the words, "I absolve you from your sins in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit." So he literally absolved all the students that were in the rectory, and one student said, "Father, does this mean we don't have to go to confession?" And he said, "Why would you go to confession? I just absolved you from your sins." And I thought, now, I know enough about the church to know that this would get you in big trouble, but he didn't really care about getting in trouble. And the effect that he was having on his students was incredible. I mean, the students thought he was the greatest thing since sliced bread. On the other hand, the parish council was out to get him, and he was having a really hard time with them. And because of my friendship with him, he sort of bestowed on me a real shocker as far as tasks that he wanted me to do. And so one Sunday he wanted to know what time I had to be at work the next morning. And I told him, and he said, "You mind stopping by here before work?" And I stopped by, and he was dressed in civilian clothes, and he handed me the keys to his car, to the rectory, to the church, and said, "Give me an hour to get out of town before you tell anybody." And so he left the active priesthood from...
Like that?
Yeah.
No announcement, no forewarning?
No forewarning. And I waited an hour before I called the president of the parish council, or whomever I called. I don't even remember at this point. But I was very sad by that, and I understood that it was something that he had to do. But with regard to my understanding of social justice and my caring about people who are at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder, it was pretty much inspired by my friendship with him. And I don't think he was at St. Patrick's more than 2 or 3 years. But there aren't many people at St. Patrick's now who remember him. And I'm sure that the people who are old enough to remember him are no more than a handful. But it was an interesting person.
Well, did he push other people as much as he seems to have pushed you?
He surely did, and he certainly would have pushed other people, although I can't remember specific sermons. But there was so much that was going on in the church at the time that was really exciting. And the monastery I'd been in, they were pretty much, the Greymoor Friars were pretty much almost in the avant-garde of the Catholic Church. And they were very excited about the opening of the Second Vatican Council, but the Second Vatican Council left them behind. And so it went even further than the Greymoor Friars perhaps would have liked. And so what the toll is on people in the parishes, it's incredible. And it's hard to imagine the number of people who probably left the church and maybe left the church for 20 years or more and before they came back, but were angry about the changes that were implemented by the Second Vatican Council. And for a lot of priests, this guy liked for people to call him Father Pete, but for a lot of priests like him, it's the kind of a kill the messenger kind of thing. Everybody could read in the newspapers about the Second Vatican Council. I mean, it was an unusual event that John the 23rd had called a Vatican Council, and that these enormous changes were being implemented. And so it's national news, it's international news, but the people who sometimes became the whipping boy for these changes were the parish priest who implemented them. And this is certainly an example, and certainly an example that I got to witness. But I never heard from him again, which was also something that was tragic. And the other thing that I did recently, they've started putting pavers down in places over the church. And I paid to have a paver with his name on it. And so I thought that was something that I needed to do. So certainly as someone who was very important with me by inspiring me to care about social justice.
And his sudden departure didn't disillusion you, or... He sounds like a complicated man.
Well, the sudden departure didn't The sudden departure didn't bother me so much because I'd left Catholic religious life myself. And even though I hadn't been in final vows or anything like he was, I was not ordained, I certainly understood the process of people leaving. And so it was sad to see him leave, and he was a good friend. But then he was moving into the secular world, and he probably felt it was inappropriate to continue contact with me. I don't know.
Okay. And another priest who I guess was influential was Father John Behan.
Yeah, and he's about 2 priests later, and this guy was a real academic. This guy had a PhD in canon law, and he used to be the secretary of his religious community, which is the Precious Blood Fathers, at international meetings, and he would take the minutes of the meetings in Latin. And so he was a real versatile intellect, and probably ideal for a parish in a college town. And maybe because both with Father Pete and Father Behan, they arrived in Lexington, and I was somebody who was active in the parish, and I was young and unmarried. And so I became very good friends with Father Behan, and as my relationship developed with Pat, who had pretty much defied her family, or particularly her mother, she had sort of backed away from the church. And when it looked like we were headed for the altar to be married, and I introduced her to Father Behan, her attitude about the church completely changed. In the first place, he was an exuberant person. He was very happy, and he was a charming guy. He also was courageous with regard to his beliefs that were controversial at the time politically. I remember one weekend I think this may have been after Nixon mined the harbors of Haiphong. He preached masses at all 3, he preached sermons at all 3 masses about the immorality of the Vietnam War. And all 3 masses, VMI people walked out. And he certainly wasn't happy with people walking out of the Mass, but he was courageous enough to dig his heels in with regard to his understanding of morality. And at the time, there are a lot of religious figures who view what's going on with Vietnam as totally immoral and totally inappropriate. And so it was really sort of interesting to be a part of watching the courageous stance that he took. But he was the priest who was still here when our child was born. He and another priest who was a friend of ours baptized Damien together. And Pat and I had great fun with this guy, and he was at St. Patrick's for about 7 years. And once again, it just ends up promoting my commitment to social justice. And during his pastorship at St. Patrick's, I started doing things also for the diocese. And for a while, I was on the diocesan Social Justice Commission, and even served as the chair of that commission for a while. And so it was like an extension of what had been started with the pastorate of Father Pete. And so those 2 people were extremely important for me.
And you've mentioned Pat. By this time, she's come into your life?
Yeah, Pat has always been influential in my life. Well, not always, because she hasn't always been there, but certainly from the very first moment we became friends. And our friendship at first was not a romantic friendship, and it certainly was not a romantic friendship for 5 years, but it was a friendship where we had a lot in common with our appreciation of the same kinds of music, the same kinds of art, the same kinds of literature, that kind of thing.
What kind of music, for example?
Well, both of us have pretty broad taste in music. We both like classical music as well as contemporary music. And so in the late 60s, we were all over the place with music. I would say, I can't say this for Pat, the only kind of music I don't like is bluegrass. But
In a wrong zone.
yeah, but Pat and I both love classical music. I like opera better than she does, but we both like jazz. We both liked Motown. And I still listen to Motown. She doesn't, and I think that she's sort of gone beyond that in her life. But at the time, we would also listen to heavy metal. And so there was a wide span of music that we listened to. And there weren't many young black people in the late 60s, early 70s who were listening to heavy metal. I mean,
No, I don't see you with Iron Butterfly and...
no. And so, but that's not to say that my preference wasn't for Motown, but there were a lot of the folk singers who were white. I really liked the stuff that they did. But so that kind of music, we both liked art. We both appreciated abstract art. We got involved in local politics, and got involved in local politics because we were both worked together to help the first black guy elected to city council win. And so we were doing stuff like that together. And in 1973, Father Ben married us. And so but Pat was one of the, we were married at the end of her junior year in college, and that was the year of the Arab oil embargo. She was going to come home on weekends. And
She was at Emory and Henry at this time.
And Emory and Henry's 3 hours away.
Yeah.
Or I was going to go down there on weekends. And then there was the Arab oil embargo and gas rationing.
Right.
And so it was not necessarily a reality that we got to see each other on every weekend. And she had a girlfriend in college who was from Boone's Mill, which is just south of Roanoke. And sometimes she would ride up with the girlfriend, and one time they ran out of gas, and the girlfriend's boyfriend had some gasoline stashed that he took to their rescue. But but after Pat graduated college, you know, there was constant nudging. You've got to do the same thing. And at the time, I had no college credits at all. And so eventually, I did the college education stuff. But
She was pretty fundamental in steering you that direction, wasn't
well, and oftentimes pretty adamant about it. And but in any case, with regard to that kind of influence, it was very important, because without her shoving, I probably wouldn't have done it. The other part of it is the sacrifices that she made, because when I quit my job to become a full-time student, we sold our house, but we sold our house at her father's suggestion, because her mother had died, and her father worked for Federal Aviation Administration, and he was getting ready to work in New York for 2 years, and he said, why don't you guys live in my house rent-free for 2 years, sell your house? So we sold our house, which ended up freeing us tremendously financially, but probably creating problems for us on the other end of my educational journey. but getting rid of the house was certainly a sacrifice that she was part of. But she also had a job that was a professional job that certainly didn't have a great salary, but
this is as treasurer.
As treasurer. She was elected well, she was appointed treasurer at first, and that was in 1974, as I recall. And the old treasurer had retired midterm. And so then she had to run for election every time thereafter. And certainly the job paid better than say an administrative assistant would make any place in Lexington at the time. But the job did not pay a fantastic salary. It paid a decent salary. And so she became the breadwinner for me and our son. And so it was also a real sacrifice because we were living off of very little money during those years that I was not working. And so she was willing to do all of that. And
she kind of put you through, didn't she?
She did. And at the graduate school level, she really hadn't bargained for that. And the graduate school level started off, I was just going to do a master's degree because I thought that you really couldn't, or you really shouldn't try to teach history at the high school level on only a bachelor's degree. And then I had the bug and wanted to keep going. And so, but she had not bargained for this full run toward a doctorate, so,
right.
but she was amenable, and so certainly an important person in my life, and we've been married for 45 years. So,
and meanwhile you were working in the biology department, you have Henry Roberts on your list of key people who have influenced
well, he was
you.
another person who nudged me with regard to college education, and not as significantly as Pat did, but at least the nudge was there. And it was a very, very strange atmosphere because the biology department was not always a comfortable place. And but it, yeah, he was a quiet man. He was a man who was responsible for a lot of things that we take for granted at W&L today. For instance, he was the chair of the committee that conceived the spring term. And so it's under his leadership that the spring term goes into being, and it was never supposed to have been a spring term where people took more than one course, and it was to be one course in depth. And so the spring term sort of got subverted by people who thought the students had too much time on their hands, which meant that they weren't really using the spring term as it was initially intended anyway.
The Goshen term.
The Goshen term. But a really wonderful man, and one of the things that's really interesting is that his wife was very, very Catholic, and he was not, but his children were. And he had one son who considered the priesthood, and his father talked him into going to Duke Divinity School, and so that was sort of the end of priesthood. But the son, Duke Divinity School is a Methodist seminary, and so the son is now a Methodist minister with still strong Catholic beliefs. And he has, since I've been ill, he's been to Lexington to see me twice. And and probably one of the holiest people I know. But his son, Fred, his youngest son, who is the Methodist minister, was also one of my scouts. So when I was doing scouting, Fred was one of the kids I worked with. So Fred tells me that he's known me ever since he was 12 years old, and he's now retired from the ministry. So, so the Robertses are certainly a part of my past.
And also in the biology department, Gary Dobbs was very important for you.
Yeah, Gary Dobbs is very important because Gary Dobbs represents to me in one way how bad the political divide is today, where people who have opposing views can't be friends. And Gary and I had completely opposing views and could talk about them, and we're never angry about it, and we're best friends. And plus the fact I was a new experience for him. I was a black friend. He grew up, his family was an upwardly mobile family whose grandparents were blue collar, and so I was this black friend, and which would have been something that would have been unusual for people in his family. And so Gary used to come to our house and have dinner, and we would have a grand time, and he and Pat and I. And he used to laugh about how our parking spaces behind what was then just Parmley Hall, it was before the Science Center was built, he would have an NRA bumper sticker on, and I would have a gun control bumper sticker on, but nonetheless, we were great friends. Gary actually, I came to know him first of all when he was a student, and a student who was very, very unusual because he used to tell me that his father had said going to school was like putting money in a bank. The more you put in, the more you got out of it. And he took this literally. And so I can remember one year he decided that he was going to do an all-nighter studying every Friday night. And he had a sleeping bag in one of the labs that was in the attic in Parmley Hall, and he would spend the night studying. And when he would get too tired to keep his eyes open, he would get in the sleeping bag and take a nap. He did not see college as a time for fun. He saw college as a time for study, and everybody in the biology department worried about him. In fact, there was great fear in the biology department that this was going to be the person who at some point took his own life, that he was competing against himself, and you can't compete against yourself. I mean, that's an impossibility. And certainly was an extraordinary student, but there was a side of his life that was certainly severely lacking, and that was this kind of social side of his life that most college students experience. When he came back to teach at Washington and Lee, he came back in Roberts' place. Roberts had had a stroke, and Roberts unfortunately died as a result of the stroke. But Gary was a temporary replacement, and then members of the department thought that this was an opportunity that was too grand, and they went to the administration, can we please find a way to keep him? And he became a tenure-track professor. Perhaps one of the interesting differences in Washington and Lee today and Washington and Lee then is that any of us could become generalist and teach other things. And so you have somebody who's coming out of Scripps Institution of Oceanography who is trained as a marine biologist who's going to teach the courses that Henry S. Roberts taught, which was histology and right now I'm forgetting the other things that Roberts taught. But Gary pretty much took over his courses, and Gary was also assigned to work very closely with a senior professor who was beginning to have some forgetfulness, but was being greatly honored. And that senior professor, whom the students loved, who was the pre-medical advisor, was upper crust Alabama. And Gary had great admiration for him. And at one point, Gary ended up doing all the grading for comparative anatomy, and this guy's course was comparative anatomy. And at one point, he was anxious to know when Gary was going to be finished with a set of papers. And there seemed to be some sort of a angst there where something happened, and I'm really not quite sure what happened, but the senior professor stopped speaking to Gary. And the department occupied 2 floors of Parmley Hall, which was a completely different configuration then because that building was gutted in the 90s for the remodel. And an area of space that was too small to have 2 members of the department who weren't speaking to each other, who were also involved with the same class. And so it became something that was very, very uncomfortable. And I seemed to be the only person who, and this is not a boast, who could oftentimes reason with Gary. And because Gary would sometimes get very defensive about things if he felt that he was being wronged. And he had raised some money for some super duper microscopes for his histology class. And another member of the department, a senior member of the department, had the audacity to borrow them from his lab without asking. And he was livid. He was just livid. And when he told me about the confrontation with this senior department member, I was just aghast. And he said to the senior department member, one of these days I'm going to have power in this department and you're going to be sorry. And I said, you really should never have said that. And so this ends up being something that was in the back of his mind for the rest of his life. One time he called me and he was really angry at a student who was cutting his labs. And I'm going to go out and I'm going to find him and I'm going to give him a piece of my mind. And I just said, no, you're not. And I said, who's he hurting, himself or you? And then he would say, I'm really glad I called you. And so the thing with the senior faculty member was I wish we had had a chance to talk before there was this indiscreet statement. And the other part is that was the year that he was coming up for tenure. And even though he got tenure, he somehow, in a very twisted way of thinking, conceived that President Huntley had interceded to save his tenure. And how he arrived at that, I have no idea. He certainly was a bright enough guy. And so that was there brewing. And chronology here is a little bit skewed, but his parents had been divorced many years, well, not many years before, but his parents had been divorced, and it was one of these ugly divorces. And he particularly favored his mother. And my office was right next to his office, and he talked really loud. And so we were both there during a February break, and we were sitting in my office laughing and joking, and the phone rang, and he went around the door to his office to answer the phone, and I could hear everything that he said on the telephone. And I was so troubled I didn't know what to do, because I knew that it was going to be a difficult moment when he got off the phone, because he had just gotten a telephone call from his mother's employer, and she was having problems at work, and she was angry with the people at work, and she had gone into the office on Sunday night with money earmarked in her purse for an ambulance, money earmarked in her purse for cremation, and a gun, and she had committed suicide at work. And so he's getting this news over the phone, and I'm thinking, well, I'm glad I'm here, but this is going to be a very difficult morning. And he comes around the door and he says, my mother just committed suicide. And I tried to console him, and my first temptation was to hug him, and he wouldn't let me hug him. And but we walked down to the travel agency together, and he immediately got tickets to Birmingham, a ticket to Birmingham, so he could take care of his mother's business. And so when he came back, there was this long period of brooding, and then I began to learn things that were extremely troubling, like his mother had talked to him about committing suicide, and he had made her promise that she'd never do it without first consulting him, and that he had told her, you realize if you do this, I'm going to have to do the same thing. And so you get this kind of information, and then you're thinking, there is really something that's really wrong here.
Yeah.
Which is why I would say this was like a Faulkner novel. The other thing that he revealed to me much later is that he had actually loaded the gun. And so the gun that his mother used, he had loaded the last time he had been at home.
Yeah.
And so, but then he was surprised that she had taken the step without first consulting him. And there was one time and he was, at that point, he was living in a faculty apartment that's now the anthropology lab. It's the farmhouse out by the soccer field. And the department had a picnic out there, and he disappeared from the picnic. And I went in to his apartment, and he was crying his eyes out. It was the first time I ever saw him cry, the only time I ever saw him cry. And that was when he told me about having loaded the gun that his mother had used. But fast forward, the university owned this place called Ben Salem Wayside. It no longer owns, but there's a log cabin out there. It's near Buena Vista, and he lived there. And the university was getting ready to sell it. He lived there for 3 years before his death, and that was where he took his own life. And he used the same gun his mother had used.
Oh.
And so it was just sort of a really crazy moment, a really
difficult
crazy
for
time.
you.
It was extremely difficult because he was one of my best friends, but I would say he was also a best friend with my wife, and he adored our child. And so it was a really, really odd situation. And so that was crazy. And he left this videotape in my mailbox where it probates his will. And it must have been made the same day that I saw him during the Christmas holidays, because he was in his office in a lab coat, and he had obviously set a tripod up with a video camera on it. And so one person was getting a high-speed centrifuge for their lab. I mean, it's really expensive stuff. I mean, he had a lot of assets. And assets that he had actually inherited from his mother.
Mm-hmm.
But the most important thing to me with regard to that friendship and its influence on me is that you can be friends with people who are politically very different from you.
Mm-hmm.
You can be friends with people who are racially different from you. You can be friends with people who are religiously different than you. He was a professed atheist.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had all of these differences in our lives, but this respect for one another and this deep bond of friendship that was very, very important. And it takes you a long time to get over the suicide of a family member or a close friend. And initially, you grieve, but then a year or so down the way, you're just angry. And you think, this was a really stupid thing.
Mm-hmm.
And especially when you involve your friends to the level you did. Me and another one of his friends from the biology department, about 6 months before the suicide, and neither one of us thought anything about it. It was just going down to a lawyer with him to witness his will. Well, the lawyer's secretary and somebody else could have been the witness of the will, but it was important that we were the witnesses. And even then, both of us didn't see him as being depressed or anything. And so, but along the way, there were so many of these plans that sort of revealed themselves, and hey, my name is on that will. And you start putting these pieces together and you think, why did you make this so personalized that you're involving people at the university that you like in this ritual of your death? And the worst part of the ritual was the will required his ashes to be strewn on the front campus without ceremony. And this was the most nightmarish part of it. His father and his sister came to Lexington for this. And I don't know how the word got around, but there were a lot of students and alumni along the colonnade. And just before 5 o'clock, President Huntley walks out of the front door of Washington Hall and halfway down the sidewalk to the chapel, and starts shaking this urn, and this crazy January wind takes these ashes into the sky, and I mean, it's just unreal. And as the president starts walking back up the sidewalk to Washington Hall, where Gary's father and sister were standing, the chapel bell starts tolling 5 o'clock, which also had a very, very eerie, added an eerie dimension to it. And then the president turns around and says, "We have just fulfilled the final wishes of Dr. Gary Dobbs," and into Washington Hall he disappears with the father and the sister. More recently, Frank Parsons gave me part of the story that I did not know, which just seemed to fit perfectly with the goriness of it. Frank Parsons, who was the man for all seasons at Washington and Lee, an alumnus who served many presidents as the assistant. Frank Parsons was the assistant to President Huntley. And Huntley didn't want any surprises with the strewing of ashes. And so Huntley had Frank Parsons to sift the ashes the day before to get rid of the big bones that might be in the urn, so that there wouldn't be any chunks of bones that were falling out. And so Frank told me about having to do that and how he took those bones down and put them in Woods Creek. And I thought, gee, that is just another part of this gory story. But it certainly was one of the most memorable things that ever happened to me at Washington and Lee.
Very macabre. And Bob McCarran was a great influence on you.
Bob McCarran was a great influence on me because Bob McCarran is the guy who hired me, and I will say things that I probably should not say here, but it's important here. Bob McCarran was a man who I had an interesting relationship with as a student because I took one of his classes and hated it. And it was colonial American history, and he had this thing where you had to do units, and you had so many books to read and so many tests to take, and the only thing that happened at class time was he gave tests, and you went to class when you wanted to take a test. And if you took 16 tests and did well on 16 tests, you got an A in the class. And I hated this system, and so you're reading books, and he's given you these prompts as you're reading of things that you should be getting out of the reading. And so when I did the course evaluation, I wrote on the evaluation that in most history classes you get different perspectives on a particular problem in history, and this way you got one historian's perspective, and it's whatever the book was that you were reading, and we didn't benefit from his knowledge of other perspectives because they were in the lectures, and that I found it to be a very troubling way to study history. And I remember walking down to Holt's office and saying, "This is my evaluation of Bob McCarran's class, and I'm signing my name to this. What do you think?" And Holt said, "Are you sure you want to sign your name to it?" And I said, "Yeah, if I'm going to be critical like this, I want to sign my name to it. I need to own what I've written." And Bob was just a wonderful person. I mean, he didn't take offense or anything. I never took another one of his classes. And so my relationship with Bob was not the same as my relationship with Holt.
Holt Merchant.
Yeah, or with anybody in the department for that matter. And so when I was having a rough patch at the State University of New York at Geneseo, where I'd had my moment with a nasty student, and a nasty student who was out to make my life miserable. And then I began to understand what my colleagues up there, why some of them had restraining orders against students. And Bob McCarran calls me when I'm going through all of this. He has no idea what my experiences are like, and I certainly haven't shared them with anybody at Washington and Lee. And Bob says to me on the telephone, and this is probably what I probably shouldn't be saying, but I'm going to. Bob says to me on the telephone, he says, "I was just in Washington Hall," and he had been an associate dean, and he said that they were complaining about their lack of black faculty and that they needed to get some black faculty. And at the time, the only person who was on the undergraduate faculty who was black was Jarvis Hall, who was the first person who taught black American politics here. And Jarvis had a commuter marriage. His wife was in the dean's office at Chapel Hill. So, and there was a black professor in the School of Law, Stephen Hobbs, who's now an endowed professor at the University of Alabama, Tuscaloosa. So there were two black faculty members on the campus, and so Bob said he gave them a chance to put their money where their mouths were. And he said, "I know somebody you could get fairly quickly, and all of you know who he is." And when asked who, Bob identified me. And then it was sort of like an of course moment. And then my wife was here as treasurer of the city, and me and Damien were in Rochester. And so at this long distance commute, And so Bob had been authorized to call me, and he said, we don't want you next year, but we want you the following year, and that'll give you a chance to finish writing the dissertation, and it'll give Damien a chance to finish the high school that he's in. And he said, you must have a degree in hand. And he said, and we want you to develop African-American, a 2-semester African-American history class. He also explained that we'd be barred against his retirement. And so it would extend the size of the history department up until the time he retired, and at the time he retired, he would not be replaced because I would be his replacement. And of course, the problem is that my training overlapped with both his training and Holt's training, but more so with Holt's training, perhaps, than with McCarran's training. And so I was so miserable with the situation at Geneseo at that moment. I said yes right away. And it gave me a lot of incentive to work hard on the dissertation, to get the damn thing finished. And so it was like he had light at the end of the tunnel. I'm glad that his timing was when it was, because I would have done anything to have gotten out of Geneseo at that point. And about 2 or 3 days later, I got a call from a woman named Mary Ferrari, who I knew from graduate school. And she was a few years ahead of me in grad school. And I guess as assistant professor, because I can't imagine at the time she was any more than assistant professor, she was the head of the history department at Radford. And she was calling to offer me a job at Radford. So Bob had called a few days before, and I was sort of glad that he had, because I would have said yes to Mary Ferrari. And I don't think I would have been happy at Radford, because I think Radford would have been like Geneseo in the South, although Geneseo is a better school than Radford, actually. But in any case, it gave me something to work toward, and I worked really hard to get the dissertation finished and to be able to land here 2 years later. And when I get here, then I get to know McCarran better, and then I did as a student. And one of the things that I really admire about him is that, number one, he really tried to protect new faculty members from a contentious department. And there would be meetings that he would suggest that I not come to. And then, after there was no longer that protection, then I understood why there were meetings that I was not invited to, or that I wish you wouldn't come to this meeting. And of course, you've seen some of those meetings in your tenure here too. And so there was, number one, that level of protection, but there was also this thing that he did that I had to admire about him, and admired about him tremendously. Bob McCarran had been a very, very private person. And during the last, as he's nearing retirement, he decides to do something that he's never done before, and that is pretty much to do social justice with regard to sexual orientation. And so Bob turns his house into a safe place for gay and lesbian students to meet. And this is before there is a non-discrimination policy on the books at W&L with regard to sexual orientation. This is back in the 90s, before any of this openness with regard to sexual orientation that we take for granted in the 20s has occurred. But he also decides that he is going to offer a course in gay and lesbian history. And much to my surprise, he lectures in this class. And my wife is so intrigued that she audited the gay and lesbian history class one of those years. And then he becomes very, very concerned about the survival of the course, and he asked me about the possibility of taking it over, and I audited it a couple of years in preparation for taking it over. And so essentially what Bob also does during this period, having been a very private person at a university where people had to be very careful, is he came out. And he came out in ways that was not dramatic, but he made no official announcement, but if anybody asked him, he would say that he had a partner. And so it was sort of interesting to see what he was also doing with his students. He was doing exit surveys with the gay and lesbian students to be able to measure the quality of their experience at Washington and Lee. And probably one of the most bizarre things that happens is he turns over these confidential interviews to me when he no longer knows what to do with them. Well, I don't know what the hell to do with them either. They're confidential. And there have been a few students who have wanted copies of those interviews, and I've had to read through to figure out who the students were. And so I've got this file of the interviews that I really don't go into, but the fact that he cared so much about these students and their experiences, and most of the students who've taken the gay and lesbian classes were not gay. And oftentimes there were these students who were just interested in the material, but they would also be students who had gay siblings and wanted to learn more because of their siblings. And there is some rich scholarship in United States history about gay and lesbian life over the course of United States history. And so some of the really impressive scholarship that I've seen in that area has been absolutely amazing. I haven't taught that course in a number of years, but I have also not asked the secretary to remove that from being listed next to my name. I think it's important that things like that are advertised. But as we conclude this, I would say real quickly, there are also students who've been inspirational to me, and some of those students, I value these are former students, I value their friendship very, very much. And one of those students I'll name real quickly before we end the tape, probably a student that whose friendship I value the most and who's been most inspirational to me is Will Kaufman of the class of 2003, who came to us as a paraplegic. And of course, is still a paraplegic. But to come to a school like this where there were hardly any accommodations for people in a wheelchair. And he made the most of 4 years here. And his wheelchair is not motorized. I watched this kid develop incredibly large biceps, wheeling himself up and down hills. But never once in 4 years did I hear him complain about anything. And he did not have the ability to drop at classes like other students because it would have driven the registrar's office crazy because most of the classrooms were not handicapped accessible. And so watching a student like him deal with the hardships of being at an institution like this certainly had a powerful effect on me. And what do I have to complain about with regard to life at Washington and Lee? So anyway,
Well, you've been a tremendous influence on many of your students. In fact, you've contributed richly to life in Lexington, life at Washington and Lee. You've contributed richly to the education of your students. You've been a wonderful colleague to have here at Washington and Lee. I think we're all glad that Bob McCarran brought you back in. The last 20 years have been very constructive and productive, and you have a lot to be proud of, Ted, and you've done an awful lot that is going to be gratefully remembered by the members of this community.
And one of the things that I would close on, and I'm not at all ashamed of the fact that, given that telephone conversation with Bob McCarran, I am not at all ashamed of the fact that I'm an affirmative action hire. Okay?
Well, you're an argument in favor of affirmative action.
Well, but the reality is this was not a job search. You know, the university reached out to me, and they reached out to me specifically because they needed black faculty. Mm-hmm. And so
well, you're one of the most beloved members of the campus, and I think probably half of Washington and Lee and half of Lexington consider you to be their best friend or one of their best friends. Well, you have a lot to be proud of.
Thank you, and I'm glad I'm back here. But
well, we're glad you're back here too.
Anyway.
Ted and I would like to close by thanking a few people who have been instrumental in helping us put together this series of conversations. I would like to thank, first of all, the people at Instructional Technologies, David Pfaff, who is right here on the other side of the camera. Brandon Busey has helped us record some of these interviews. Julie Knudsen was a driving force in getting this show on the road. We've had a tremendous amount of help from Tom Kamen in special collections at the library. Of course, we've had help from members of the history department. Molly Mitchell-Moore chatted with you, and Barton Myers chatted with you. Mark Connor is going to be conducting an interview with you. I think the provost's interest in this project has been significant and important. And we should also thank our transcriber, the woman who's going to be transcribing these interviews, Barbara Muller in Baltimore, and Mame Warren, who has done many of these interviews of other faculty before. So we thank all of these people. And again, Ted, I thank you for your friendship and for these very informative discussions.
Thank you.